Hello, I'm Father Norm Douglas, Executive Director of Heart to Heart Communications. Welcome to this edition of Spirit at Work, a program in which we interview people about their lives, what matters to them, what their core values are, and especially how they connect their spirituality with their daily work. Here with me is the co-founder of Heart to Heart. He's an attorney, and I like to call him Larry the Lawyer, Larry Villeman.
Hello. And I know you may think that a lawyer and a priest talking about spirituality in the workplace might be the beginning of a good joke. But years ago, Norm and I got together and explored the question, how do you practically connect faith, values, ethics with the work that you do, with everyday life? We'll be right back with our guest to explore that further.
Today, our guest is Reverend Sandy Selby, the Associate Pastor at Furnace Street Mission. And that mission, we'll be hearing more about it, also reaches out to crime victims and those who've been traumatized by any kind of difficult situation. Welcome, Sandy. Good to have you here. You know, it's very timely, this particular taping of this show, where it's very recently the horrible tragedy in Copley in which a man murdered 7 people, including children. And I know that's traumatized the whole community. We have folks watching this program that I'm sure, especially in Northeast Ohio, have been deeply affected. Just watching, just reading the paper. Any comments you can give to folks out there who even are affected by it just by the media?
Sure, and I think I've talked to lots of people, Norm, in the last week, and actually preached about this last Sunday. I was a guest preacher at church, and so many people came up to me and said afterwards, "I'm so glad you talked about this," because people are horrified. The first thing I would say is if you are really feeling that you're in trouble and need someone to talk to with some urgency, then I would call 911. Or I would call info line, which is 211, and ask to be put in touch with some mental health counselors. So that's in the immediacy of the moment. But if you really just need someone to talk to, pick someone who is a trusted person that you feel you can be honest with. A friend, a pastor. If you don't have a pastor, you can call Furnace Street Mission and I'll talk to you.
Sure.
376-0040. But don't feel that you're alone in this. And mostly I would say talk to God. Because God is here. God is all loving, so I would take it as a matter of faith to just talk through it with God. If you need something to read, I would read the Psalms.
Well, thinking about that, I'm sure at a time like this, that looking to God for that inner strength and peace that can be found nowhere else. On the other hand, there are people who say, hey, I'm not sure about this, God. I mean, if God is so loving and so caring, why didn't He prevent this from happening? What do you say to folks then?
It depends on where they are in the immediacy of the moment. If I had been one of the people who went to the crime scene, and I was not, the victim assistance folks did that, in the immediacy of a crisis, people will say, why did God do this? Where's God? And it's a cry that comes out of some urgency. That is not the time to say, well, here's the way that God works. They're not looking for theology. My mentor, Bob Denton, says, don't rearrange the theological furniture when the house is burning down. You know, you kind of have to go with what people have. But if people, now that 7 days have passed, or people out in the community would say that to me, where's God? You know, why didn't God stop this from happening? It has to do with the way in which God's power works, the way that God works in the world. God is always a loving God, but God does not, and in some sense cannot, just step in to stop what's happened because God gave us free will and part of God's love for us. And so we get into these situations where horrible things happen, and it's a very natural thing to question God. And then some people say, well, I can't be angry with God. God can handle it. You know that. You read the Psalms, and there's anger at God all over the place. So in this time, it's a very natural question to ask. And if anybody says, I know that God had a plan for this to happen, and I'm absolutely sure, I would take great I had difficulty
Oh,
with that.
and I've heard,
yeah.
I've heard people say, well, you know, you just have to understand this was God's will.
I know that. And
Yeah.
people say that because in a situation of chaos, we want to have someone be in control of it.
Yeah.
And what better person
Yeah.
or what better entity than God? So people will say it's God's will so that they can, in some sense, feel that it's entrusted to God's care. Yeah. But if that's interpreted that, well, this was done, God let this happen, or even make this happen to teach people a lesson, does terrible damage to people spiritually and psychologically. And it's very irresponsible for a pastor in particular, or someone in religious authority, to say that. So it's not God's will, it's not God's plan. What God wills for is for love, for peace, and comfort. And God works continually in that. And that's what I believe, that where God was in that horrible situation in Copley is that God was with those people in those moments of terror. Yeah. And that's what we have to believe, that they were in God's love, they are in God's love, and they are in God's peace. Yeah.
And I know, thinking about it, and again, you're right, you can't give some glib answer at the moment, but that horrible evil and that tragedy didn't have the final say.
No,
you
that's
know,
right.
That God's life, God's promise of everlasting life, God's love is what goes on forever, and
right.
to believe that, and to believe that love is the greatest power and is forever.
Right. Everything else is penultimate. God always has the last word.
Yeah.
And you know, in the creation story in Genesis and in the new creation is right at the end of the Bible in Revelation.
Yes.
And it's a new heaven and a new earth, and all people are reconciled through God's love. I mean, that's the promise, and that's the hope that carries us through that. So absolutely, God is ultimate. Everything else, evil, death, sin, tragedy, are penultimate.
Yeah.
God's greater than all of
So
it.
obviously, faith giving a real perspective on things for
yeah.
folks over time.
Yeah.
Let me ask this too. What about people, again, that may be watching, that their children have become fearful, or mommy, you know, could our neighbor, you know, he's not always been so nice to us. What do you say to parents to speak to their children?
Well, it will depend on the age of the children, obviously. And I would say, please call your pediatrician if you have concerns about what's age appropriate to say. Talk to people that you know at Children's Hospital. You can call them, because they certainly know how to deal with this. Children fear abandonment. Children fear that. Children fear not being, you know, the loss of safety more than anything else. And so that's something parents always deal with. But in this case, let your children know that you are there for them.
Yes.
If you're people of faith, let them know that God is there for them. Yeah. But depending on the age of the child, you have to do this in very, very concrete ways. Yeah. And so the main thing that they want to know is that this is not going to happen to them.
Yes.
And that these people, that bad people aren't around them that are going to do this. They need to know that they're safe.
Yeah, that this is so highly unusual, that's why it makes news.
It's unusual, which is why it makes news. And this is, you know, in the crisis field, this is an extremely traumatic, abnormal event. Yeah. And so any reactions that any of us are having, loss of sleep, inability to concentrate, high anxiety, that's normal. These are normal responses to normal events. And so one of the things that we need to do with children, and even our adult friends that are feeling like they're in crisis, is to try to stabilize the situation and normalize what people are feeling. Because you're afraid, it doesn't mean you're losing your mind. I mean, I've talked to people that live a mile away from there that are like, oh my God, you know, I can't believe how much this has affected me. I can't get out of my mind the thought of what it must be like, and I feel like I'm kind of losing my grip. That's normal. Yeah. That's normal.
Yeah, and that certainly helps. I mean, I know, talking with folks too, sometimes people can feel so isolated, looking at everybody else saying they look like they're doing fine, and internally I'm all riled up.
Oh yeah, and it's normal to be. I felt that way. I listened to the press conference as I could right after the event, the day after the event, And when I've read the Beacon Journal, and I can't get certain things out of my mind, and what I have to do is just sit back and take a deep breath and put it in God's care, put it in God's hands.
Now, I know you also deal with the responders there, including in this situation. What do you do for them? I mean, this is their work, so they know they may have to do this, but they probably never think when they become, you know, a medic or a police officer that they're going to see this kind of reality. What's that been like? Have you been talking with some of those folks? What are the issues they particularly face?
Furnace Street Mission started victim assistance in the early 70s, and so we work very closely in that. And my colleague Bob Denton is the head of Furnace Street Mission. He's also the chaplain to the Akron Police Department. So he was on scene and very, very much involved in working with them. The victim assistance folks have been working very closely in the crime scene and with the victims. And you're right. They're trained to do this kind of work, but even for people that do this kind of work, this is an event that obviously is outside of the norm. And so there's a very formal process called debriefing that's done with some regularity. Bob does this for the, excuse me, for the safety forces, and others do this. And then I and other people are trained to do this with other folks. And so what we do is meet with people, we talk to them, they talk to each other. Really, a lot of it is that same crisis intervention that you do with other people in terms of normalizing people's experiences. What can happen over time with people who do difficult crisis work is what's called vicarious traumatization, that you can be vicariously traumatized by what you work with, and it's a process that happens over time. And lots of social workers and others deal with this in all kinds of settings. What can happen is that your worldview can be changed in a really fundamental way, such that the world isn't safe anymore. It can really change the way you see things, and then ultimately you can become burned out. That's not unusual for people. So what we do in a situation like this is really talk to people as close as we can to the event, to try to work through what people are thinking. What's the hardest thing about this for you? What memory would you love to get out of your head if you possibly could? And then, are you experiencing any symptoms that are difficult for you? As I mentioned a couple before, difficulty sleeping, irritability and anger, which are normal things. And then try to work with people to have, you know, what are positive ways to cope with this. But the important thing is to give people a safe place to talk about what's happened and to share. And fortunately, really in the people that I know in the various agencies that work closely in the crime scenes, there's great collegiality and teamwork. So they kind of help each other. But we're all normal people who have fears, people who are parents, you know, that do this kind of work. It's very, very difficult, particularly if it's a child that's been affected by it. And so we learn as part of our training to put up appropriate boundaries, but sometimes that's really, really difficult to do.
Well, let me ask that. For you, I mean, with a focused attention on this, how does this affect you inwardly, and what do you do with your feelings?
Well, I'm affected by what I hear. I'm affected by seeing other people that are in pain. You know, the thing that I, and you know this from being a pastor, when you're with people that are in trouble, what's most important is to be a non-anxious presence, to listen non-judgmentally, and that's what I try to do. Well, there's anxiety going on within me. You better believe it. You know, how can I not be? And so, so what I do is I have trusted people that I can talk to, because there's this debriefing the debriefers kind of a phenomenon, and it's and just to really have people, you know, that I can count on. And you said this earlier on. We're not alone. We often feel we're alone when we're afraid, or when there's something bad going on, or everybody else seems normal, but we're not. You know, we're not alone, and so we all need to have people that we can talk to. I also know my limits, and there have been situations. I work as a chaplain part-time at Children's in general as part of my ministry, and I can remember a couple of times, particularly at General, where there were situations from my own history that were, all of a sudden that's my mother lying in that bed, that's not somebody. And we're trained to know how to deal with that, and there's sometimes you just have to excuse yourself and leave. And so it's really, for me, how I deal with it is just to keep in touch with where I am. And know that I'm not perfect, and say, yeah, I'm afraid too, and this is really painful. And to feel free to cry when I need to do that,
one of the probably tricky issues in all of this too is this notion of forgiveness, that comes out of the Christian perspective and simply being human. And how do you deal with that when it's so horrible?
In this particular case, I know what Bob Denton has always said, that his counsel is not to forgive too quickly, and not to demand that people forgive too quickly, because in order to forgive, we have to know what it is we've lost. We have to recognize what has happened. Now, obviously, if someone has had a child killed, I mean, you know what's been lost. But it takes a while for the enormity of that to sink in. And I think I've heard Bob say something like, don't even think about it for 6 months or something along those lines. So forgiveness is something that Christ tells us to do as Christians. And I think as a pastor, for me, the way I deal with this is never to demand that someone forgive, but to walk with someone through that process, because it has to come from their own heart in their own time. And I have known people who I have felt were so stuck years past something that often with forgiveness of self, that's something that I've kind of tried to open them up to be willing to do. But to demand that of someone, and particularly in the immediacy of a crisis, is really not responsible.
Is there some confusion for folks around forgiveness too? Because I'll sometimes hear, hey, this person did something horrible, or this person needs to face the consequences for what they've done. You can't forgive them.
Facing the consequences and forgiveness are two different things, in my view. That there are consequences, certainly legal consequences for what people do. There are, but so, there's a legal system, and then there's what goes on in our heart, and I think that people should be held accountable. We should try to reconcile people to God, to society, but ultimately we ourselves have to think about how is it that we come to some ability to place it in God's hands, and to really relieve our heart of that burden of condemnation.
Often wonder too how people deal with like trigger events. I mean, I even think coming up is the 10th anniversary of 9/11. I mean, people are affected by what they saw on TV 10 years ago. Probably some of these folks will be affected by because they just had a recent trauma.
And that's actually, I was thinking about 9/11. Interestingly enough, in the lectionary, which, as you know, is the cycle of readings that's appointed in 3-year cycles, the lectionary reading for 9/11 anniversary is Forgiving 70 times 7.
Whoa,
There's 2 readings in the lectionary that are all about forgiveness, and so that's going to be a real challenge for that time. But the trigger of 9/11 will be there for all of us, and in terms of, they're going to continually show things. And that was a trauma for everybody, and in varying degrees. And so my advice to people is to be around other people, and don't go through that alone. I expect more people will be in church as they were in 9/11, 2001, as you know, and I hope that people will listen to responsible media coverage, and to try to be open to the knowledge that nothing can separate us from God's love, and that's the passage from Romans 8 that I'm going to keep with me. Nothing can separate us from the love of God, and to have everything around that event and its remembrance be in God's light, in God's light. And then to be, I know there's going to be some community events. There's one at Faith Lutheran at 4 o'clock that afternoon for the community. There will probably be others. Attend those and remember in community is what I would recommend. Yeah. This is going to be hard for everybody.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you ever, in what you do, have even momentary doubts? Like, yeah, I say, God, you're here, you're a God of love, I really believe that, but there are moments that maybe I wonder.
Well, I've had that in my past. Really, I lost one of my sisters to a tragic death when I was 30, and I tossed it all. I mean, I just tossed it all, and in terms of what I thought I believed, and I lived in that ambiguity for years, and I feel that the faith I have now, I never doubt in God's loving presence. But I don't think in any way I've figured out, nor will I ever figure out the way that God works in the world. Or, so what I trust in is what we talked about earlier, is basically God's enduring love and God's promise that all things will ultimately be reconciled to God in a new creation, which is really the basis of Christian hope. And the new heavens and the new earth. And of that I'm convinced. But everything else, it's just part of the journey.
Oh yeah. Well, we're going to conclude here in a moment, but do you have any closing comment you'd like to make around everything we've talked about here that we leave our folks with?
I'd like to say this. My work through Furnace Street Mission and in partnership with Victim Assistance brings me into contact with a lot of frontline people. People, victim assistance, children who witness violence, rape crisis, the guardianship, people that work with elder abuse issues. What is a comfort to me is that we have a lot of people in this community that care and that do their work well and that collaborate. And so we have that community, and then we have the safety forces community that we work with very closely. People care, and what that says is that we're just not in this alone. If you feel that you need somebody to talk to, get on the phone, call InfoLine, and find somebody to help you.
Make the connection.
Make the connection. It's all about relationship.
Well, hey, on that note, thank you for this relationship and for sharing with all our folks very significantly about what it means to be human in the midst of all of life, including its pain.
Yeah, thanks.
Good to have you here with us.
It's a joy to
I'll
be
be
here
back
with you.
in a moment for a brief closing segment. Hi, I'm Father Norm Douglas.
And I'm Larry Villeman. We founded Heart to Heart Communications to strengthen the connections between people's inner spirit, ethical values, and daily work. We believe that this focus upon the inner development of individuals is a necessary foundation for enhancing workplace relationships, purpose, ethics, wellness, and productivity.
Heart to Heart Communications offers values-based leadership development programs that exist to guide and inspire employees, especially leaders who want to make a difference. The unique curriculum is grounded in the belief that there's a strong connection between employee personal and spiritual development and the vitality and success of every business.
You may not know who we are, but you do know who you are and what you believe in, and how you feel about the importance of living out your values in a vital work environment.
Let us come into your company and show you the benefits of a more productive and creative environment. Work can become more exciting, more purposeful, and more fulfilling when employees are growing individually and together.
Consider the idea of a 60 to 90-minute program on renewing the purpose and spirit of your relationships at work. Call us, email us, get in touch with us. We'd be happy to connect with you.
Welcome back to this closing segment of Spirit at Work. You probably noticed Larry Villeman, my partner usually in this program, is away. He's out of state at this time, and so I'm going to share a few reflections. It's kind of like talking to myself, but you're listening in. Anyway, wasn't Sandy quite something? And in just what she does and the passion and with which she does what she does. And it reminded me, some of you may not know, when at the first anniversary of 9/11, I was in Pennsylvania, in Shanksville, talking with and mainly listening to a lot of the family members who lost someone in 9/11 on the plane at Flight 93. And just real struck of how important it was, this was a year later, for people to be able to share their stories, for people to be able to connect with one another, for people to be able to laugh and cry about remembrances from loved ones, again a year later, and for people to begin to see that there was some healing going on and some hope and gathering too with a real faith perspective that made a difference. And so, you know, everything that Sandy said, I think, comes to bear in almost any situation, even the everyday stuff that all of us deal with, the loss of someone in illness or someone moving away that we've cared so deeply about. We're human, we're going to feel. It's important to get in touch with those feelings and share them. And finally, I'd re-echo what Sandy said. Thank you to all those professionals who do so much to reach out and care to make a difference and be healers. Hope to see you again at another segment.